I'm so excited. My youngest is getting married this Saturday to her longtime girlfriend. They've been living together for years, bought a house together, have a dog. They're going to be adopting. I mean, just all kinds of. It's wonderful. And Louise and I are here, and friends of ours are here from Vermont and from all over the place. It's just great. So. My apologies, since we're doing a remote broadcast, if our audio or video quality isn't exactly what it should be, but we're trying out a brand new Comrec system, and actually I think we're doing a pretty good job here. But I wanted to talk just a little bit more about North Korea and then pick up your phone calls here. The name of the CNN documentary that I watched from the hotel room in Frankfurt Saturday night was... on CNN International. It was titled Secret State, Inside North Korea. And in fact, I think it was Pat Sweeney put a link to the YouTube of it over on our chat room. You can find our chat room. It's free. It's and there's not even ads or anything. It's over at thomhartmann.com. And I strongly recommend watching it. I didn't watch the whole thing. I fell asleep right toward the end of it because it was on like at, I don't know, I got into Frankfurt in the airport around 1 o'clock in the morning and probably fell asleep around 1:40. But it was, it surprised me a lot. I mean, I learned a lot about North Korea. And one of the things that I think that Americans don't understand or don't think about is if you're old enough to remember the Vietnam era, or for that matter, any part, from the McCarthy era forward, from the 1950s all the way to the fall of the Soviet Union. If you're old enough to remember that, you know what I'm talking about just from experience. And if you're not old enough to remember that, you probably have heard about this. And if you take any history classes, you'll certainly learn about it. And that is that the reason that first of all, that communism essentially was not a nihilistic political philosophy or economic philosophy. In other words, it wasn't a death cult, essentially. The whole point of communism was for everybody to have housing, for everybody to have medical care, for everybody to have food, for everybody to have a job, for everybody to have, the opportunity to live life in a positive and favorable way. That was the theory, right? It's not actually how it worked out, although I've known many people over my lifetime, and particularly during the year that I lived in Germany, who have lived under both, the communist East Germany and the Western West Germany, and who would say, East Germans, who would say, it wasn't all that bad. Yeah, we had to wait in line for food sometimes, but nobody freaked out if they got sick. Nobody freaked out if you never had to worry about finding an apartment or whatever. But the point is that because communism excluded the possibility of big corporations, right? The state ran all the businesses. You had this huge corporate, the entire corporate machine in the United States, the entire capitalist machine in the United States, from the banks to the manufacturers to the politicians that they own, were all saying, "Oh, we can't have communism." And see, of course, communism was an evangelical philosophy, right? Karl Marx wrote this thing, and he said, if only everybody would do it, right? Evangelistic things always started out, if only everybody would, right? So if only everybody would adopt this way of living, then life would be a paradise. And as I said, it didn't turn out. This is not a sales pitch for communism. I'm trying to make a point here about evangelism. And this is a really important point when you think about North Korea. So we went to war in South Vietnam, and North Vietnam, and Laos and Cambodia illegally. We went to war to stop communism. It was a proxy war with the Soviet Union, arguably, and China. China, Mao had taken over China with communism, and the Soviet Union had a slightly different kind of communism. And neither one of them were really the kind of communism that Karl Marx was pitching, but whatever. They were evangelical, and they were trying to spread their communism around the world. It had come to Cuba. We were freaked out about that. There were countries in Central and South America that were flirting with the idea of maybe not communism, but something halfway there. And so because it was evangelical, we viewed the Soviet Union they had the greatest power. China was just a third world country for all practical purposes. But we viewed these communist countries, North Vietnam, for example, as actual threats because they could evangelize Americans. They could convince Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, and yes, I know there's still a debate about whether they were even guilty, but they could convince Americans to say, you know, America should become like the Soviet Union, and I'm going to work toward that kind of thing. You know, because it was evangelical, the fear in the United States was that they would evangelize our people. Similarly, the fear of the Soviet Union, because they saw capitalism as a corrupt system that produces poverty and suffering, and people don't have access to health care, and people are homeless, and their lives get wiped out, and there's no guaranteed jobs, and no guaranteed health care, and no guaranteed education, all that kind of stuff that was all there and free in the communist countries. The communists viewed us as a threat, and we were evangelical, right? We've got Freedom House, and we've got all these other right-wing organizations or these neoconservative organizations funded in many cases by the government, by our own government, plus our State Department outreaches. And so they viewed us as evangelical and therefore as a threat. I would argue that the biggest danger with regard to Wahhabism slash what Donald Trump would refer to as radical Islamic terrorism is its evangelical nature. The fact that it's evangelized, reaching around the world and trying to convert people to its way of thinking and its way of life. And similarly, they would argue, and in fact, I would even argue that at a certain level and for slightly different reasons, that certain types of toxic fundamentalist Christianity, the types that want to control women's bodies, the types that want to refuse to offer service to gay people, the types that use Christianity to justify racism and sexism and misogyny, because they're evangelical, that they're toxic and dangerous. So just consider that frame for a minute, that it's the evangelism of a particular society. See, I have no problem with a society saying, we have the best way of life on earth for us, right? Because this was, I mean, you go back and you read Peter Farb, you know, in First Contact with Native Americans back in the late 1600s, in the mid 1600s in the United States. And every community he came across, their word for human or person or man was considered the name of their language. In other words, you know, I am Apache, because Apache is human, right? Or whatever the word may be. Now, I may be wrong about Apache, but generally speaking, that was the case. And so, as long as we say, this is my way and I like it for me, that's fine. But when we start to say, this is my way, I like it for me, it's the best way, it's the only way, you should have this way, and if you don't have this way, I'm going to bomb you, which is what we did with Vietnam. Right? It's what we've done around the world for years and years. It's what we've done in less violent ways, but arguably just as destructive. It's what we did with Chile. It's what we did with Argentina. It's what we did with Central America during the Reagan administration. We have done it over and over and over again. So in this kind of thought cloud that I just shared with you, of all the different dimensions, whether they're political / economic, communism versus capitalism, or whether they're religious, you know, evangelical Christianity, evangelical Islam, or, you know, the more toxic versions of evangelical Christianity and Islam. Those are the things that can make a country dangerous. You'll recall the German belt buckles during World War II. Hitler's army, their belt buckles said, Gott mit uns, God with us. And they believed it. Or the soldiers did, you know, I'm fighting for God, right? The Crusades, we're fighting for God. So, put all that in like one little cloud here and set it off to the side. And now consider North Korea. How does North Korea represent a threat to us? They don't have a philosophy that they're trying to sell to us. It's a kingdom with a king, basically. I mean, it's a feudal society. The Kim family basically owns the country and owns all the people, just like feudal serfs were owned by the feudal lords. He's not trying to export it, not trying to sell it to anybody. He's not trying to convert, you know, other than the possibility of merging with South Korea, which is kind of an amorphous thing. But basically, it's not evangelical. He's not trying to expand his territory. You'll recall Hitler's first thing was we need more living room, more breathing room, more room for good Germans. And so he took the Sudetenland, the part of northern Czechoslovakia, as I recall. And then, in 39 invaded Poland, and then we were off to the races. But it was all about expanding Greater Germany. We did the same thing. President Polk did it in the 1840s. Abraham Lincoln railed against the Mexican-American War. We did the same thing in the late 1890s, 1889, I think it was, that William Randolph Hearst said to Frederick Remington, who was down in Cuba, the USS Maine blew up, right? And said, if you can get me the photos, I'll get you the war. And we got the Spanish-American War as a result of that. Because, hey, we're trying to expand our sphere of influence. Well, I don't see North Korea doing that. So it seems to me that they don't, frankly, represent a threat to us. They don't represent an ideological threat, a philosophical threat, an economic threat, a religious threat. But with nuclear weapons, they could do a lot of damage if we attacked them. It appears to me that everything they're trying to do is defensive. And I don't know why we're not having this conversation in our media.